guys, welcome back. Now we've got a lot to cover today, but real quick, I just wanted to give an update on Tsuton, since about 80% of the comments on the last video were asking about him. But yeah, he's doing a lot better now, pretty much back to normal aside from a few scars. It was a scary week, but thankfully he's gonna be fine. And I really appreciate all the kind messages, except for that one guy who said my cat deserved it because I didn't like the tick game. YouTube really can be a special place sometimes. But anyway, let's get to the games, since I know that's what you're all here for anyway. This week we're gonna check out a few more movie games on the Super Nintendo, and I'm going in blind on just about every one of them, so this is gonna be like a mystery grab bag. And we're gonna start that grab bag with a movie that maybe reached a little bit too far in trying to convince us on just how much we were gonna love it. The Flintstones Movie for the Super NES is a clunky but surprisingly playable tie-in that's more solid than a lot of people give it credit for. Now, if you were alive back in the early 90s, you might remember this weird time where old Hanna-Barbera and Warner Brothers cartoons suddenly started making a comeback, for reasons I still don't fully understand. Studios were dusting off these old Saturday morning relics and throwing them back into the spotlight like we'd all been begging for a Top Cat reboot. And the Flintstones was one of the first to get the big screen treatment. The live-action movie dropped in 1994 with a surprisingly stacked cast. John Goodman as Fred, Rick Moranis as Barney, Rosie O'Donnell as Betty, and even Halle Berry as a vivacious secretary who definitely wasn't in the original cartoon.
Am I interrupting?
Universal clearly wanted this to be a massive hit, to the point where they were pumping out merchandise before anyone even knew what the characters would look like in the movie.
Sorry, Barn.
I'm not exaggerating when I say this movie was absolutely everywhere. You couldn't go a day without seeing it plastered all over something. And if you thought you could dodge the inevitable video game tie-in, you were very wrong.
Look great with my bone china.
The Flintstones movie game for the Super Nintendo was released back in 1995 by Ocean Software. Now, if you're not familiar with Ocean, all you really need to know is that they made a ton of movie tie-in games back then. And their quality all ranged from pretty okay to clearance bin trash. So going in, you never quite knew what you were gonna get. But the question is, does the Flintstones for the Super NES land on the better side of things? Or is it just another forgettable movie game destined for the clearance bin? Start the game up and you're met with a side-scrolling platformer that you just knew this game was gonna be. You control John Goodman, well, it's Fred Flintstone, but I mean, look at it, through a series of levels that are loosely inspired by scenes from the movie. Your main tool throughout the game is Fred's club, which you'll use to take out enemies and smash through obstacles. It works well enough, but the range is incredibly short. You pretty much have to be right on top of whatever you're trying to hit. Because of that, you'll end up taking more damage than you probably should. Not from bad timing, but just from trying to swat at something that's barely out of reach. It also doesn't help that the game's physics are oddly exaggerated. Fred builds up momentum in a weird way, like he's always a little bit too heavy or a beat behind where you want him to be. Half the time the challenge isn't the level design, it's just trying to get Fred to land where you want him to. And speaking of that level design, it's really not all that bad. They're kind of like those large explorable levels that I usually don't like at all, but honestly I didn't really mind it here. It was actually kind of fun just hunting around for the different power-ups like Fred's bowling ball or something like that are just stuck around in random spots. Most of the stages are pretty straightforward, just hop around and make it to the exit. But there is one level in Bedrock that switches things up a little bit, since you have to bounce Bam Bam and pebbles across rooftops. Like I said, I don't think the level design's bad at all. It's actually pretty decent in spots. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to how it feels to move Fred around these things, and I think that's where most people are going to have problems with this game. Because as soon as the game leans harder into actual platforming, those weird heavy physics that Fred has becomes a real problem. As mentioned, Fred feels like a bag of bowling balls, and landing those precise jumps sucks in this game. So even when the levels are fun to explore, Fred just doesn't handle well enough to keep up. But at least they're all nice to look at while you're throwing your controller at the screen. The game actually looks really good, way better than I actually expected. I've said before that no matter how rough Ocean Software's games played, they almost always looked decent, and the Flintstones is no exception. For better or worse, Fred's sprite looks uncannily close to John Goodman from the movie, and he's animated surprisingly well. The stages are all nicely drawn with some impressive color blending for the time. The forest level, for example, has leaf and branch textures that almost look CG. That said, some of the tile sets can get a little repetitive, especially in the city or factory areas where you're seeing the same walls and platforms over and over again. But for a tie-in to the Flintstones movie, I mean, this is a pretty solid looking game. But overall, I mean, the Flintstones isn't awful. I went in expecting a total turd fest with this one, so maybe that helped. It's not great, it's definitely clunky and has some frustrating moments, but there's a basic level of competence here that a lot of Ocean Software games just didn't always manage. The biggest hurdle, though, is just getting used to Fred's weird floaty physics, and yes, that is definitely a thing, but if you can get past that, what's here is a surprisingly okay little platformer. And really, surprisingly okay is high praise when we're talking about the same developer that gave us Pugsley's Scavenger Hunt. So yeah, the Flintstones isn't exactly a yabba dabba do, but at least it's not a yabba dabba don't. The Mask for the Super Nintendo tries to capture the movie's wild energy and kinda pulls it off.
All that is about to change.
When The Mask hit theaters back in 1994, it was pretty much an instant hit. Jim Carrey was already pretty popular thanks to Ace Ventura and Dumb and Dumber, but The Mask felt like the perfect place to just let him lose his f***ing mind.
My mask!
And thanks to some pretty decent looking 90s CG, that's exactly what happened. The movie had this crazy energy that you usually only see in a cartoon, and went on to be one of the year's biggest movies. And of course, when you got a movie this popular, you gotta have one of those video games to go along with it.
The Mask.
The Mask was released for the Super Nintendo back in 1995 by Black Pearl Software, a studio I had honestly never even heard of, but The Mask seems to be their one big original licensed effort. And judging by the back of the box, it looks like a solid attempt to bring the movie's chaos to the Super Nintendo. So let's see if this game really does put on the mask, or if it should have just been left in the closet. You, of course, take control of the mask in what's basically your standard platformer. You run through each level dispatching random goons and totally innocent bystanders until you eventually make it to the end of the stage. The game's big gimmick is, of course, letting you get to use a bunch of powers pulled straight from the movie, like bashing enemies with a giant cartoon mallet or spinning into a full-on Tasmanian tornado. It's fun until you realize you can't just go nuts with them. Every one of these powers drains your mask power number at the bottom of the screen, because of course even supernatural chaos has a cooldown. The number does slowly recharge over time, but you'll still be scrambling to collect floating M icons just to stockpile enough juice for the next area. And you'll want all of that juice, especially when the game decides to throw in one of its many terrible boss fights at you. It's not the worst system in the world that you could have used for this game, but it definitely puts a leash on the fun. Because when you run out of mask power, all you're left with is just your punch, and it takes like 10 hits to kill even the most basic dudes with this thing. But when you got a ton of mask power and you're just tearing through enemies, that's when the game's at its best. It almost nails the chaotic feel of the movie. But the problem is that the game traps all of that wild, chaotic fun inside of levels that feel way more confined than they should. Every level's like a giant maze, packed with dead ends, hidden walls, and multi-floor layouts that constantly stall your progress. You'll be backtracking a good deal here, hunting for some random breakable wall or event that you were just somehow supposed to know that you could teleport through. And while things look pretty decent at first, the tile sets here repeat so much that it starts to feel like you're stuck in a cartoon purgatory where just about every hallway looks the same. It also doesn't help that the enemies roaming these levels are super basic, but just love to ambush you with cheap shots, making what should have been a fast-paced action platformer feel like a much slower game. But at least it looks really good. As mentioned, the animation work on the mask is surprisingly strong, with tons of little touches in just about everything he does. Whether he's jumping, punching, or just standing idle, there seems like there's always some sort of animation straight from the movie happening. Even something as simple as teleporting through these vents has this cool swirling animation. And even when you die, the game doesn't just fade to black. You get a full scene of Stanley removing the mask and just standing there in his pajamas. It's stuff like this that at least makes the game fun to look at, even if it's kinda tedious to play at times. The Mask for the Super Nintendo is one of those games that could have been a lot more fun if the developers just had a better handle on level design. Black Pearl Software definitely got the energy of the Mask right, but it's just all buried under terrible stages and some really, really bad boss fights. It's actually really frustrating because the fun is there, it just never quite clicks the way that it should. But if you're a fan of the movie, it still might be worth checking out. There's definitely some fun in just messing around with the powers and soaking in the animation, just don't expect it to be
smoking!
Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventures for the Super Nintendo promises 3 movies worth of whip-cracking adventure and mostly delivers. If I had a hero growing up in the 80s, it was probably Indiana Jones. Indy was exactly who I wanted to be when I was 8 years old. A gruff old guy exploring ancient tombs with a cool hat and an even cooler whip. I was obsessed to the point where I actually somehow managed to get my dad to give me an actual bullwhip, which I still have to this day. But as much as I loved Indiana Jones, I never really played many of the games based on the movies. In fact, the only one that I even remember touching was the Temple of Doom arcade game at my local grocery store, and that wasn't exactly a great game. Outside of that though, I just never really felt the urge to pick up anything with Indy on the cover, including this game. Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventures hit the Super Nintendo back in 1994, and surprisingly, it was the only Indiana Jones game to land on the system, which is kind of wild considering just how many indie games came out over the years. But this one had some weight behind it, because it was published by LucasArts and developed by none other than Factor 5, which is actually most of the same crew that was behind the Super Star Wars trilogy. But instead of dragging things out across 3 separate titles, this one promised all 3 movies packed into a single cartridge. But the big question is, did Indy's Super Nintendo debut actually deliver, or is it just another relic better left buried? And yeah, if you played the Super Star Wars trilogy, then I think you know exactly what you're gonna get here. It's basically those games, but with an Indiana Jones skin slapped on top of it. So if the stiff controls, slippery platforming, and constant cheap hits from those games drove you nuts, then you might want to steer clear of Indy. But if you're like me and really didn't mind that jank too much, then there's kind of a lot to like with this one. Playing the game goes just about how you'd expect. You take control of Indy through just about every major scene from all 3 movies. In Raiders, for example, you'll explore booby-trapped caves, brawl your way through a burning bar in Nepal, and then end up in Egypt punching Nazis, just like you'd hope. Most of these are pretty straightforward action platforming levels where you either shoot or whip your way through. Your main weapon is of course Indy's trusty whip, and while it's not the flashiest attack since it's just as stiff as the rest of the game feels, it's still pretty satisfying in that dollar store Castlevania game kind of way. In addition to his whip, Indy also gets access to a pistol and grenades throughout the game. The pistol's decent for picking off enemies from a distance, though it's so slow you kinda just don't want to ever use it. It's really only useful when your whip can't reach, which honestly isn't that often. The grenades are basically this game's version of a thermal detonator, since it's great for clearing out groups of tougher enemies when things get dicey. They're limited though, so you'll want to save them for emergencies, or when you're just tired of dealing with a screen full of birds or bats. Controlling Indy though is where things get to be a little bit hit or miss. Now I don't think it's as rough as the Super Star Wars trilogy, at least Indy isn't getting knocked around like a bullied 3rd grader here, but he still feels stiff, just like those games, especially when it comes to jumping. The platforming here isn't quite as crazy as it was in the Super Star Wars games, but you're still dealing with the same awkward floaty jumps that never quite feel right. To the game's credit, it does a decent job of working Indy's whip into the platforming, since he can use it to grapple onto hooks and swing across gaps, which adds a nice bit of variety. But even that can feel clunky at times, since the timing and hit detection are just finicky enough to make simple swings more irritating than they should be. Now with that being said, you're probably wondering how this game handles having 3 entire movies packed into it. Well, like I mentioned earlier, it plays out more like a greatest hits collection of big moments from the films. And because all 3 movies are crammed into one game, each movie's trimmed down quite a bit. But honestly, I think it works in the game's favor. Super Star Wars had a bad habit of dragging levels out for way too long, sometimes even inventing completely random ones just to pad things out. Indiana Jones doesn't really do that. Most levels here go by pretty quick, and the game's always shifting you to the next big movie plot point before anything gets too stale, at least for most of the game anyway. The locations change up pretty often, and even if some of the stages do drag on a bit, the pace of the game keeps things moving to avoid the burnout that bogged down a lot of the Star Wars games. You even get some vehicle levels to mix things up, though these aren't nearly as involved as the ones in Super Star Wars. But at least they do a good job of mixing things up when they do show up. Honestly, I think the thing that bugs me the most about the game are the graphics. Now, I'm not saying that the game looks bad or anything like that, but I think you might have noticed an overwhelming amount of brown in just about every single level. And yeah, I get that the movies had a lot of brown in them too, but from a gameplay perspective, it just makes a lot of these stages start blurring together after a minute. Even stages that shouldn't have brown in them are somehow brown, and I just don't understand that. But overall, I think this one's kinda tough to pin down. If you played the Super Star Wars trilogy, you'll feel right at home with Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventures. It plays almost exactly the same, and while it's not quite as punishing, it still has that same stiff, slightly unresponsive feel baked into the controls that those games had. And if you didn't like it there, you're not gonna like it here either. That being said though, I still think it works a little bit better here in Indy, mostly because it's condensed instead of dragging each movie out into a full-length game. It's got its problems, but if you're an Indiana Jones fan and missed out on it like I did when I was a kid, then yeah, check this one out. It may not be the holy grail of Super Nintendo games, but it's easily one of the better attempts at an Indiana Jones game on consoles. Cutthroat Island for the Super NES sets sail for mediocrity, but this is one voyage you probably won't want to remember. Now, I'm not going to make fun of you if you had no idea that this game was based on an actual movie, because most people seem to not. Cutthroat Island hit theaters back in 1995 and wasn't just a flop, it was one of the biggest box office bombs of all time. The movie tanked so hard that it actually helped sink an entire studio behind it. And honestly, reading about the behind-the-scenes chaos is probably more entertaining than anything in the movie, or the Super Nintendo game for that matter. Believe it or not, Cutthroat Island was released for the Super Nintendo back in 1996, developed by none other than console workhorse Software Creations. If the name doesn't ring a bell, then you might remember them from their earlier beat-em-up Maximum Carnage. So a pirate-themed brawler shouldn't have been too far outside their wheelhouse, or at least you'd think so. And that's exactly what Cutthroat Island for the Super NES is, a swashbuckling pirate beat-em-up that sort of follows the movie. And I'm gonna say sorta because I haven't actually seen the movie, so I'll let you guys tell me in the comments if it does or not. But the game does at least seem to have the same characters and what appears to be the same basic plot, so I'm just gonna roll with it. What I do know is that you walk around the screen stabbing your way through endless waves of enemy pirates. And honestly, I think if that was done well, then I think that's a pretty solid setup for this one. But just like the film it's based on, Cutthroat Island doesn't quite live up to the fantasy. First off, let's get the good stuff out of the way, because it's not all bad. Visually, I think the game actually looks kinda neat. It has a bit of that early LucasArts adventure game vibe look to it, with some nice looking sprites and decent character animation to go along with them. The color palette's definitely more on the washed out side of things, but overall it's not unpleasant to look at, and honestly, playing it isn't either. Your character feels fairly responsive, and swinging your sword around is almost always a good time. Most stages play out in short bursts, where you wander around and stab any pirate that comes your way. But the game also throws in a bunch of areas that require exploration, only it gives no indication that these spots are even accessible by you. Like, I had no idea you could walk down this alley because it just looked like part of the background art. The same goes for the various buildings that you can enter. They just blend right in, with nothing to suggest that they're even part of the level. And none of that's really too frustrating, at least until you hit a boss fight. And that's when the game suddenly shifts into what can only be described as a completely awful fighting game. You and the boss get locked onto a single plane, like something out of Street Fighter, except this ain't nothing like Street Fighter. I mean, the game's barely a brawler at the best of times, and now you're just flailing away at an enemy that can take off half your health in just one hit. Add in some of the worst hit detection that I've seen in a while, and it just becomes a complete mess. The only somewhat interesting thing that the game does gameplay-wise is let you switch between sword fighting and a brawler mode. And if you are somehow having too much fun swinging your sword around, brawler mode lets you throw in a couple of punches before pulling the sword out. I think this was meant to make the game feel more like a traditional beat 'em up, but considering you already have a punch button, I'm not really sure what the point of this is. But beside all that, this is just the definition of a game that feels incomplete. I was originally planning to do a more in-depth review of this game because it honestly just kind of fascinates me, until I looked up a long play and realized that the game barely lasts more than half an hour, and it reuses the same 4 or 5 enemies the whole game. There is some variety with the occasional vehicle stage and those exploration areas that I mentioned, but everything still feels half-finished. There's not even a sound effect for the gun that you can pick up. Technically, yes, there is a full game here. You can play through it start to finish, but so much of it just feels like it was rushed out the door. Maybe they knew the movie was a sinking ship and just wanted something on store shelves before it completely tanked. It plays like a game that exists because it had to, not because anyone actually wanted to make it. So yeah, I think you can probably safely skip this one. I don't think I can even recommend it to fans of the movie because I'm not entirely sure those people even exist. Still, you're probably better just watching that movie and steering clear of this forgotten pirate's booty altogether. And that's gonna do it for me, since I'm pretty sure I hit my limit on movie tie-in sliminess this week. Now, even as a kid, I always knew that these games were cash grabs, but I don't think I realized just how manipulative they were, especially with the Flintstones. Everything around that movie felt like it was just trying way too hard to be your best friend, like that Fred doll commercial, where they really want you to believe this kid is emotionally bonded with a tiny John Goodman. As a kid, I didn't really think twice about it, but digging up these clips for these reviews, it kind of made me feel a little gross. Anyway, that's another bunch of movie games down the hole, and pretty much all of these were lifted directly from comments on the last movie game video. So let me know in the comments on this one which ones would be worth tackling on the next video. And maybe while you're at it, slap that like button if you happen to like this video. Or maybe even a sub if you want to see some more movie games in the future. But that's all I can take this week, kids. Check back next week for some more games to talk about. But until then, thanks for watching.